She took off her shirt for a routine checkup, and the doctor froze when he saw the mark on her shoulder. He'd seen that mark before, the night she saved a girl from a fire 20 years ago. Hello, my friends. Before I start this amazing story, leave a comment saying where you're coming from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Emily Carter woke up before her alarm even went off, with that strange feeling of someone who hasn't had enough rest. The room was still dark, but she could hear the sound of the first buses passing outside, mixed with Grandma Evelyn's soft snoring in the other room. She lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling with her eyes open, wondering whether or not she should go to the hospital that Saturday. The truth is, she didn't want to. That appointment had been put off for weeks until her grandmother put her foot down. "It's free, Emily, and you need to take care of your health before it's too late," she said. And she said it so lovingly, but also so firmly, that Emily didn't have the courage to put it off any longer. She got up, put some water on the stove to heat it up, and went to wash her face in the sink in the backyard, trying to shake off her nervousness. As she drank the thin black coffee that her grandmother had prepared, Emily kept her gaze down, stirring the spoon slowly. Grandma Evelyn, even with her advanced age and leg problems, maintained that determined expression, as if she still ruled the house with her gaze. "Have you showered yet? Wear the blue pants, the ones that are more fitted. Bring your ID and card, and get there early, because otherwise it will be crowded," she said between sips of coffee. Emily just nodded, without arguing. Deep down, she knew that her grandmother only wanted the best for her. She thanked her quietly, picked up her worn purse, and left the house with the first rays of sunlight gently hitting the busy streets of Maplewood. The sky was clear, but the heat was already starting to rise. At the bus stop, she waited for the bus with 3 other ladies, all chatting loudly about recipes, back pain, and noisy grandchildren. The journey to the hospital was made in silence. Emily sat by the window and watched the simple houses and businesses opening their doors. I didn't know exactly why that day was weighing so heavily. Maybe it was fear of a diagnosis. Maybe it was just shame. He never liked doctors, much less exams. She always had a strange feeling of being exposed, vulnerable. He remembered the mark on his shoulder, that half moon that looked like it had been burned into his skin. Since I was a teenager, I avoided blouses that showed my shoulders. I thought it was ugly and flashy, and no one has ever been able to explain exactly where it came from. When she was a child, they said it was the fire, but she didn't remember anything. Not from the fire, not from the orphanage, not from faces. He only had nightmares sometimes with smoke and muffled screams. Arriving near the hospital, he took a deep breath. "Just an exam," she muttered to herself. "Everything will be fine." The entrance to Walker Central Hospital was large and modern, with air conditioning right at the door and uniformed attendants guiding patients. Emily felt small inside. Everything was clean, bright, full of electronic panels and signs that took her a while to understand. She approached the reception desk with the appointment form in her hand, and the smiling woman behind the counter asked for her full name and ID. "Emily Carter, you're scheduled for a gynecology appointment, right?" the receptionist confirmed, typing quickly. Emily nodded shyly. The woman explained that there would be a short wait, as the doctor scheduled had an unforeseen event, and the director of the unit would take over some of the appointments that day. "Dr. Andrew Walker, one of the best we have," she said with a professional smile. Emily felt a silly shiver. "Director? Why? Me?" she thought. But she took the number and sat down with a knot in her stomach, unaware that that day would change her life completely. Emily sat there for several minutes, between an elderly man napping next to her and a mother trying to entertain her young son with a packet of cookies. The place was clean and calm, but the sound of the electronic panel calling out numbers made her even more nervous. She clutched the strap of her bag as if it anchored her in the present. She watched the other women waiting like her and felt a mixture of shame and insecurity. She had never been one to go to the doctor very often. She always put others first. Her grandmother's medicine, the gas that was expiring, the pharmacy uniform. She herself was last on the list. When the number 183 lit up on the screen, she hesitated for a second before standing up. The receptionist pointed to the corridor of the gynecology ward. and Emily followed with short, almost restrained steps, feeling the sweat trickle down the back of her neck. The door to the room was half open, and she knocked lightly twice before entering. "Please come in," a firm voice answered from inside. Emily pushed the door open slowly, her eyes downcast, and entered. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The room was large, with a light-colored wooden desk, a few shelves of medical books, and an air conditioner that made the air too cold. Behind the desk, a man in a white lab coat looked up from his computer and regarded her with polite neutrality. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter?" he asked. Emily nodded, unable to say anything right away. Andrew stood up and extended his hand professionally. "I'm Dr. Andrew Walker. I'll be performing your exam today, okay?" She shook his hand quickly, feeling her palm a little damp with tension. "Okay," she replied in a whisper. They were both silent for a few seconds, that seemed longer than they actually were. Andrew gestured to the chair next to his desk and asked her to fill out a quick form while he checked the digital file. All the while, he discreetly observed her gestures, the way she held her pen with a slight tremor, the way she avoided direct eye contact, the careful way she folded the paper when she was done. Something about this young woman touched him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. She seemed out of place, as if she wasn't used to taking up this kind of space, as if she was apologizing for existing there. "Have you ever had a gynecological exam before?" he asked calmly, trying to lighten the mood. Emily shook her head. "Just once. Years ago." Andrew nodded, without judgment, and patiently explained what he would do. "It's going to be a quick exam, okay? If you feel uncomfortable, we'll stop. You're in control." She thanked him softly and walked over to the screen where the disposable aprons were kept. She slowly took off her outer clothing, folding each piece with exaggerated care, as if that gesture were the only thing she could. Still control. The cold air made her skin crawl. She put on the apron, tied it as best she could, and took a deep breath before saying in a low voice, "Ready." Andrew approached, put on his gloves, and maintained a professional and respectful tone the entire time. As he began the clinical examination, he noticed that she was tense, with her shoulders hunched. "Is everything okay, Emily?" he asked softly. "Yes, just nervous," she replied. And then, when he asked her to turn her body slightly to examine the side of her abdomen, he noticed in a flash something on her skin, but he didn't react immediately. He continued the examination with focus, as he had learned from a young age. Even when something shakes inside, on the outside, the hand must remain steady. Andrew finished the exam with a slight, hidden tremor in his hands. He was trained to deal with pressure, with difficult diagnoses, with operating room decisions. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. When his eyes found the crescent-shaped mark on Emily's left shoulder, his heart raced in a way it hadn't in a long time. It was the same mark, the same one he'd never forgotten, even after 2 decades. The shape, the size, even the tone of the skin around it. It was as if the past had been plucked from a nightmare and dumped there, in front of him, in the silence of a cold office. But he couldn't react. He had to stay focused, respect the moment, not let it show. He swallowed hard, stepped back, and carefully removed his gloves. "Everything's fine here," he said, trying hard to keep his tone calm. "You can get dressed, don't worry." Emily responded with a barely audible, "Okay," and went back behind the screen. There, his heart also beat faster, but for other reasons. She felt that something strange had happened. During the examination, he noticed the doctor's look was different, a moment of pause, as if he had seen something out of place. But he didn't say anything. He just backed away quickly and looked distant. As she put on the blouse, her thoughts were racing. Was it her imagination? Had he noticed the mark? That mark that she hid even from herself, that not even Grandma Evelyn could explain for sure. Emily glanced at herself in the small mirror beside the screen, fixed her hair, and took a deep breath. She was already used to feeling out of place in environments like that, but there was something different about that doctor, something she couldn't name, but that made her restless. When she left, Andrew was standing next to the desk, his eyes fixed on her medical records on the computer. He closed the file quickly and smiled discreetly. "Your tests are normal so far. We'll wait for the lab results, but overall, everything is fine, he said, his voice professional but softer than before. Emily nodded, picked up her bag and thanked him. Thank you, doctor. She was ready to leave, but hesitated with her hand on the doorknob. Something in her told her she should ask, make conversation, understand that look in his eyes, but she couldn't. She left with hurried steps, as if she wanted to escape from a place that had left invisible marks. Andrew stood there, motionless for a few seconds, until he let out a heavy sigh. He sat down, took off his glasses, and rubbed his face with his hands. This couldn't be a coincidence. She needed to confirm. She needed to be sure that her own memory wasn't fooling her. Later, in his private room, Andrew typed her full name into the hospital system. Emily Carter, he read quietly. The name didn't mean much, but when he cross-referenced it with old records from the 1998 fire at St. Gabriel Orphanage, his heart sank. Emily was one of the few survivors listed. She had been rescued without identification and, days later, taken in by a social worker who put her up for adoption. No record of her biological parents. No prior history. It was her. There was no doubt anymore. Andrew leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For a moment, part of him wanted to run to her, tell her everything. Another part told him to wait, think, act calmly. He couldn't force anything. She had a right to her own story. He had to respect that. But what would he do now, knowing that the little girl he had held in his arms, amidst screams and smoke, was now a woman and had passed him by as a stranger? Emily spent the rest of the day with a strange feeling in her chest. She couldn't explain why. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the nervousness of the exam, or the embarrassment of having been seen by someone so serious, so observant. But deep down, something about that doctor kept hammering away at her mind. The way he looked at her. For a moment, it seemed like he recognized her. And that bothered her, because she knew it wasn't possible. She didn't know any doctors. She didn't know almost anyone other than the neighborhood and the pharmacy where she worked. That night she tried to tell Grandma Evelyn, but she didn't know how. She ended up just saying that everything went well, that the exam had gone smoothly. Grandma smiled, satisfied. See? Now all we have to do is get the results later and that's it, she said, going back to knitting with that air of mission accomplished. Emily nodded, but didn't say anything else. She remained silent, watching the fan slowly turn on the ceiling. Across town, Andrew spent the rest of the day trying to concentrate, but failing miserably. The image of the crescent-shaped mark seemed to be etched into his retina. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the moment he found her that night at the orphanage, covered in soot, shaking, her eyes wide. She must have been about 6 years old. He carried that memory throughout his life, not as a burden but as something unfinished, like a book without an ending. And now, knowing that that little girl had grown up, survived and was there, alive, an adult, walking around the same city, that affected him, in a way he couldn't describe. For a long time, he doubted whether it had even happened or whether his memory had made up parts of it. But no, it was real. And now, given what he had discovered, he didn't want to force anything. But I also couldn't just let it go. 2 days later, Emily returned to the hospital to pick up the report. It was late afternoon, and she had left work early, still wearing her pharmacy uniform under her blouse. She had calmed down, but her heart started beating faster as she entered the building. She didn't know if she would ever see that doctor again, and honestly, she didn't even know if she wanted to. She picked up the report in the indicated area, and, as she was heading for the exit, she heard a familiar voice call her name. "Emily?" he said, in a neutral but attentive tone. She turned slowly and saw him standing in the hallway, without a lab coat, with a more relaxed expression than before. Andrew approached calmly, respecting the distance. "I'm sorry to approach you like this, but I wanted to know if you have a few minutes. Can I buy you a coffee?" he asked, with a slight smile on the corner of his mouth. Emily hesitated, surprised. "Do you, always invite patients for coffee?" she replied, a little disconcerted. He laughed briefly. No, but you're not just any patient. Emily stood still for a moment, wondering whether to accept. But there was something sincere about the invitation, and she herself was curious, still trying to understand the strangeness of their previous encounter. Okay, maybe, she said, without much conviction, but already starting to walk beside him. They went down to the cafeteria on the ground floor of the hospital. It was a simple place, with small white tables and large windows, where a few doctors were talking quietly while drinking coffee. They sat in a more secluded corner, and he ordered 2 coffees with milk. For a few seconds, they were silent, until Andrew finally took a breath. Emily, I know this may seem strange, but I have something to tell you. Something from the past. Something about you. She frowned, confused. What do you mean? She asked. He looked down for a moment, then met her eyes. I was there, at the fire, that night. I was the one who got you out of there. It took Emily a few seconds to comprehend what she had just heard. His words, I was the one who got you out of there, hung in the air, as if time had stopped. She sat back slightly in her chair, as if she needed space to breathe. Andrew's gaze was not invasive, but steady, full of truth. The fire? She asked, almost breathless. Were you there? That night? Andrew nodded with a restrained gesture. Yes, I was just a teenager, 15. I was volunteering in a school program. When it all started, it was chaos. Screaming, smoke, people running. And in the middle of it all, I saw you. You were huddled in the corner of a room, shaking, almost in shock. Emily kept her eyes lowered, but a tear slipped without, her realizing it. Her hands were shaking in her lap, and her breathing began to falter. I never knew if you survived, Andrew continued, his voice breaking. After that day, you disappeared from the systems. You had no name, no documents, just that mark on your shoulder, the half moon. I tried to look for it, but you were adopted and changed your name. I moved on, but I never forgot. Emily looked up slowly. There was pain in her eyes, but also something new, like a kind of recognition that came from within. Do you remember me because of the mark? She asked, instinctively touching her shoulder. Andrew took a deep breath. Not just because of that. I remember your face, your crying, your expression. And when I saw you there in the office, for a moment I knew, but I needed to confirm. That's why I looked up your medical records. Emily interrupted him in a firmer tone. Did you go through my medical records? I did, he admitted bluntly. And maybe it was wrong, but I had to be. Sure, I carried that night for 20 years, Emily. You were just a little girl, and I never knew what happened next. It shaped me. I created the pediatric ward of the hospital because of you, because of what I experienced that night. Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand, still trying to make sense of it all. I don't remember much of it. I just dream about smoke sometimes. They always told me I was rescued from a fire, but no one could explain who pulled me out. Not even me. The only thing that was left was this mark. I thought it was ugly. I always hid it. Andrew rested his elbows on the table, intertwining his fingers, and spoke sincerely. That mark saved you, and now it's brought me to you again. Emily was silent for a long time. She didn't know how to react to all of this. It was as if a door had been opened inside her, but what lay beyond was a tangle of hazy memories, mixed emotions, and unanswered questions. It's a lot to take in, Doctor, she finally said, her voice still thick. Andrew nodded. I understand, and I don't expect you to feel anything right now. I just thought you had a right to know. It wasn't easy for me to keep this in for so long, but I needed you to know that someone was there, that someone cared. Emily looked at him more softly. Thank you for telling me. And she stood there, holding the now cold cup of coffee, her heart in turmoil, but for the first time in a long time, feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was closer to understanding who she was. In the days that followed their conversation at the cafe, Emily found herself recalling Andrew's words with surprising frequency. It was as if the past, which had always been a distant haze, had finally taken on a shape, a face, a voice. And it wasn't just any voice, it was the voice of someone who had been there, at the most defining moment of her life. At work, she would sometimes lose her concentration in the middle of a call, staring into space, remembering the look on his face when he'd said, "I never knew if you survived." It had shaken her in a way she couldn't explain. It was as if someone had pulled an invisible thread inside her, and now it was all starting to unravel. There was no euphoria, no romance yet. There was something deeper, recognition, gratitude, and a kind of care she'd never felt from a man before. Andrew, for his part, began to visit the pharmacy discreetly but regularly. Sometimes he would buy eye drops he didn't need, or a regular painkiller, just to see her. They talked quickly, kindly, and a little awkwardly at first, but little by little the smiles came more easily. One day he waited for her shift to end and asked her simply, "Would you mind if I walked you home?" Emily hesitated, looked around, and then responded with a slight nod. They walked through the streets of the neighborhood as the sun set between the low buildings. He listened more than he spoke, and she, little by little, told him little bits of her life, with Grandma Evelyn, of the studies she didn't finish, her passion for reading, and the difficulty she had in trusting people. "I don't really know what it's like to have roots," she said at one point. "But my grandmother, she's the closest I have to that." Grandma Evelyn didn't take long to notice him. The first time Andrew appeared at the door, with a bag of whole wheat bread in his hand, she looked him up and down and said, "Oh, so you're the doctor who's been hanging around my granddaughter." He laughed, a little embarrassed, and Emily blushed immediately. But the old lady, who had the gift of feeling what words couldn't say, ended up liking him. She served coffee with cornstarch cookies and started a conversation. Andrew, even though he was used to sophisticated events and corporate dinners, felt genuinely welcomed in that simple room, with its antique furniture and the smell of bar soap. "You're lucky, Emily. A grandmother like that is a treasure," he said, sincerely. And Grandma Evelyn replied, without losing her direct tone, "And you have good eyes, because my granddaughter is a rare jewel. She just needs a little more courage to shine." Over time, the visits became natural. Andrew would drop by unannounced, sometimes just to ask how she was doing. Other days, he would bring books, a simple flower, or a recipe for a tea he swore was good for anxiety. Emily began to open up more. She felt like she could trust. And more than that, she felt like she was being seen. Not as a pharmacy clerk, not as a survivor with no past, but as someone who had value, even with her silences and her fears. "It's like he sees parts of me that I didn't even know existed," she told her grandmother one night, her eyes brimming with tears. And when she heard that, Grandma Evelyn just held her hand tightly and replied, "So listen to this carefully, mija, because sometimes that's how you find out who you really are, when someone looks at you and sees not just the scars, but also what you can still be." It was on a cloudy afternoon that Emily received the results of her complementary tests. She went to the hospital alone, while Andrew was in a meeting with the surgical team. The doctor on duty calmly explained. There was a small cyst that required monitoring and treatment. Nothing serious, but that would require periodic checkups, some medication, and tests every 3 months. Emily nodded, but inside she felt her stomach churning. She had never liked dealing with issues related to her own body. She left the office with an envelope in her hand and a weight on her shoulders, as if that word, treatment, had an echo that reminded her of fragility. When she got home, she tried to hide it. Grandma Evelyn noticed something in her expression, but respected her silence. The next day, when Andrew showed up, she was the one who told him. "She went yesterday to get the test. She came back different. The girl doesn't talk, but her eyes give it away." Andrew didn't insist at that moment. He waited until Emily was ready, and she was. After a cup of mint tea and a few minutes of silence on the couch, she said, "I need to treat something. It's nothing serious, but it made me vulnerable." He listened to her attentively, without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't say anything. He just said, "If you want, I can accompany you to each appointment, but only if you want." And then, after another sip of tea, he made a suggestion that seemed to come from another time. "When I was a teenager, writing helped me understand what I felt. Have you ever thought about writing? Even if it's just for yourself, just to get it out of your head." Emily found it strange at first. Writing? About what? He shrugged with a half-smile. About whatever comes. About whatever hurts. Or about whatever you don't even know you feel yet. At first, she resisted. I thought I didn't know how to write, that I had nothing to say. But that same night, he picked up an old notebook covered in contact paper which he used to write down shopping lists and addresses. He wrote a simple sentence. I didn't feel strong today. Then another. The mark on my shoulder burns sometimes, but it's not the skin, it's inside. And without understanding, the sentences turned into paragraphs. She remembered old dreams, fragments of memories with the smell of smoke, the sound of voices she didn't know who they belonged to. He wrote without a filter, as if he were emptying a suitcase that had been kept for years. Little by little, that became a habit. I wrote before going to sleep, sometimes as soon as I woke up. Andrew read the texts with respect, without correcting, without giving opinions. Just read. And each time she handed out a new notebook, she said sincerely, "You have something powerful here, Emily. This needs to be read by more people." The writing process became almost therapeutic. Emily began to find herself there, in the words. She wrote about Grandma, Evelyn, about the customers at the pharmacy, about the times when she felt invisible, and also about the childhood she didn't remember, but that she began to reconstruct with the scraps of memory and imagination. She wrote about the fire, about the night when, without knowing it, she was carried by someone who, 20 years later, would sit with her for coffee. And the more she wrote, the more she felt that something inside her was aligning. Maybe my story began in the fire, but it's only just beginning to be told, she wrote one night, at the bottom of a page. When Andrew read that sentence, he was silent for a long time. Then he closed the notebook slowly, looked at her with teary eyes and said, "Emily, this book already exists. You're just figuring out how to write it." Emily had already written almost 3 entire notebooks when it happened. It was a normal afternoon, the kind she spent at the hospital for one of her follow-up appointments. Andrew was in his office, taking care of some pending issues between meetings, when she appeared with an envelope in her hand and a shy smile. "I brought more pages," he said, handing it over. He welcomed her with the same warmth as always, and then invited her to wait a little in his office while he finished reviewing some reports. Emily sat down near the bookshelf, looking at the medical books and diplomas on the wall. Everything there smelled of organization and history, but it was on the side table, among seemingly unimportant papers, that she saw the folder. It was large, made of black cardboard. On impulse, she slowly pulled it out and opened it. Inside were old newspaper clippings, photos of the orphanage, reports of the fire, and a copy of her file, with her name, estimated age at the time, and medical notes. The shock was immediate. The blood rushed to her head. She looked at it as if she were facing a trap. Her heart raced and a feeling of violation spread through her chest. When Andrew came back and saw her, with the folder in her hands, he froze. "Emily, I can explain," he said, taking a step forward. But she had already stood up, her eyes watering, her breathing ragged. "Were you investigating me?" she asked, in a tone he had never heard come out of her mouth. "Was it all part of a plan? To rescue me again? To get closer? To feel like a hero?" Andrew shook his head hard. "No, it's not that. I needed to understand if it was really you. That girl I saved. She was important to me. I never did it out of vanity. But what we have now..." "Emily, this is not part of any plan." She backed away. "You should have trusted me. I thought you saw me." Emily left the room without hearing anything else. She felt as if she had been ripped away again from the security she was beginning to build. She walked home, ignoring the buses, not responding to Andrew's texts. She spent the next few days in silence, without writing, without talking, just existing on autopilot. Grandma Evelyn tried to understand what was happening, but she would only say, "It's okay," but it wasn't. The pain came from a deep place, from someone who had already had her identity erased once, and now found herself being studied, researched, as if she were a clinical case. The notebooks remained locked in a drawer, along with the courage she thought she had gained. It hurt to know that the very person who had opened the doors of her memory had also tampered with the locks without asking permission. And it hurt even more to Remember the way he looked at her, as if he really saw her. Andrew respected her silence. He sent her a single message. I don't want you to feel exposed. I just want you to know that I never held this against you, and that I'm still here. But he didn't insist. He knew he needed to give her space. He also felt Emily's absence like an open wound. The days seemed longer, the hospital routine became gray again, and the hallways seemed colder than ever. In the early hours of the morning, he would reread the passages she had written, trying to understand how to transform regret into reparation. But he also knew he couldn't force a reunion. He had to wait, hope that the words she herself had left in her notebooks would be the way back. Because deep down, he knew she was still writing, even if only inside herself. The week passed slowly. Time seemed stretched out, as if everything was on hold. Emily would come home from work in silence. She wouldn't write anymore. She would even avoid looking at her own notebooks. She was hurt, yes, but more than that, she was confused. Part of her missed Andrew's presence, the coffees, the short walks, the silences that seemed understood. But another part still hurt. That feeling of having been studied, exposed without consent, stirred deep. Until, one Sunday morning, when Grandma Evelyn was watering the plants on the porch, Andrew appeared at the gate. He brought no flowers, no books, no bags. He brought only himself, with a tired expression and empty hands. "Is she here?" he asked quietly. Grandma Evelyn nodded without saying a word, and opened the door. Emily was in her room, sitting on the bed, with her notebook closed on her lap, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Andrew appeared in the doorway and stopped, respecting the distance. She looked up slowly, surprised and suspicious. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I didn't come to justify myself. I just came to say what I haven't said properly yet." She remained silent, and he came in, sitting in the chair next to the bed. "Emily, I've been looking for you for half my life, not out of obsession, not out of vanity, but because that moment left its mark on me. And when I saw you there again, something in me changed. And yes, I went looking for answers, but I didn't know it would hurt you like this. What we built wasn't planned. It happened. It was real, at least for me." She held the notebook tightly between her fingers. "I didn't know what to believe anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I trusted you, and when I saw those papers, it seemed like everything had been set up, as if I were just another curious case in your life." Andrew lowered his head, visibly touched. "You're not a case. You're the most alive person I've ever met, the most genuine, and I was wrong. Not because I wanted to know, but because I didn't know how to wait for your time, for not asking if you wanted to open those doors." Emily took a deep breath. She looked at him for a few seconds and then said, calmer, "You didn't save me just once, Andrew. You saved me twice. That night, and now, when you made me write." She opened the notebook, flipped through a few pages, and showed him a note he hadn't read yet. "Even when everything seems under control, writing grounds me. It reminds me that I am more than what happened to me." Andrew read it silently and nodded, moved. "You have a voice that needs to be heard, Emily." And right there, in that small room, with the morning light coming in through the cracks in the window, the two met again, not as doctor and patient, not as survivor and savior, but as two people marked by the same fire, trying to rebuild their stories. Emily rested her head on his shoulder for the first time, and for the first time Andrew cried without hiding it. After that conversation, something settled inside Emily. It wasn't as if everything had suddenly been resolved. There were still doubts, there was still hurt in some corners, but for the first time she felt she had room to rebuild. She started writing again that same afternoon, as if there was no more time to waste. And what had previously been timid pages now gained body, rhythm, and courage. Andrew read each new text with respect and admiration. He never suggested changes. He just read and said, "Keep going. This is alive." Emily began writing about everything: the fire, the lack of memories, the loneliness of childhood, the reunion with Andrew, and the process of discovering herself in the midst of chaos. She wrote on the bus, during breaks at the pharmacy, in the early hours of the morning when she woke up with a heaviness in her chest and only found relief in words. One night, While reviewing one of the most intense texts, Emily looked at Andrew and asked, somewhat awkwardly, "Do you think this could become a book?" He didn't hesitate. "I think this is already a book." From that moment on, the two of them began organizing the notebooks. Andrew used his free time to scan the pages, review the structure, help her with what he knew about publishing. But it was Emily who guided everything. It was her story, and she knew exactly how she wanted to tell it. She chose the title almost instinctively, Half Moon. It was the name of the brand, yes, but it was also the part of her that she had always hidden, and that now became a symbol of strength. When she showed the cover to Grandma Evelyn, her grandmother couldn't hold back her tears. "You're telling the world what I've always known, that you have light, even in the shadows." The launch took place months later, at a community library in the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was full of real people. Neighbors, colleagues from the pharmacy, former teachers, and even patients from the hospital showed up. Andrew arrived early, arranged the chairs, brought flowers, and tried not to draw attention to himself. But everyone could see the sparkle in his eyes as he watched. Emily calmly signed books, always smiling, always listening to whoever stopped to say that they had been moved by a page. When it was time to give her speech, Emily took a deep breath, holding the microphone with both hands. "I never thought I would have a story to tell. For a long time, I thought my life had begun and ended on a night of fire. But when I started writing, I discovered that surviving wasn't the end. It was just the beginning." She paused, looked at Andrew, and continued, "This book is about memories that hurt, but also about reunions that heal, about marks that we carry on our bodies and in our hearts, and about how writing can rekindle what seemed extinguished." Timid applause spread throughout the room, and Andrew, unable to contain himself, discreetly wiped his eyes. At that moment, he was not the respected doctor, nor the director of the hospital network. He was just a man who, years later, met the girl he had never forgotten, and watched her become the author of her, own story. Emily stepped down from the small stage and hugged him tightly. "Thank you for staying," she whispered. He replied softly, in her ear, "I never left, Emily. I was just waiting for you to write the way back." The community library where the book launch took place wasn't big, but that afternoon it felt like the most important place in the world. The walls were covered in hand-drawn posters, with excerpts from Emily's book written in colorful letters. A neighbor had brought balloons, another brought simple sweets, and the owner of the stationery store provided the plastic chairs. Every detail was filled with affection. Andrew helped set up the table with books covered in recycled paper, with a half moon drawn in watercolor on the cover. Emily wore a light blue dress and her hair down. She was nervous, but she smiled the whole time, as if she still couldn't believe that it was all real. Grandma Evelyn, sitting in the front row, held her cane tightly, her eyes filled with tears from the moment they entered the room. "She did it," she whispered softly, almost like a prayer. Before Emily could even begin to speak, people from the neighborhood came up to her to tell her how they felt after reading excerpts posted on social media. "I read that part about the brand and I cried, because I also have a scar that I've never accepted," said one young woman. A man told us that his daughter had also been adopted after a fire. An employee at another hospital said that she started writing because of Emily's writings. Each story was like a piece of the puzzle that she didn't even know she had dropped along the way. Andrew, who had been outside for a few minutes, watched the scene from afar with a lump in his throat. He had seen many patients recover, many projects succeed, but nothing like this, nothing so true. Emily wasn't just launching a book, she was giving meaning to so many people who also had untold memories. After her speech, she spent almost 2 hours signing books. Each dedication was carefully thought out. For an older woman, she wrote, "Your story matters too." For a child, she drew a half moon and wrote, "Don't hide your light." When a shy girl said she wanted to write but didn't think she had the talent, Emily replied firmly, "If you feel something strong inside, that's enough to start." The line never seemed to end, and even though she was tired, she didn't complain. It seemed that everything she had experienced up until that point her day led to that exact moment. When the copies were sold out, Andrew brought a blank notebook. and she continued writing handwritten dedications for those who were still waiting. "The book is over, but the story continues," she said, smiling. No one wanted to leave, and no one forgot what that previously silent girl now said, with the strength of someone who had finally been heard. In the following days, social media began to buzz. A simple video of the launch went viral. It was Emily reading the I passage about surviving the fire and finding a voice in writing. Comments came from other cities, from other countries. Publishers began to send messages. A journalist from the capital called asking if he could interview her. Emily answered everything calmly, without letting herself be dazzled. She simply said, "I just wrote what I felt." And it seems that many other people felt it too. Andrew followed closely, but always respected her space. He didn't want to be the center of anything. He just wanted to see her grow. Grandma Evelyn, who at first didn't even know what sharing a story meant, now even had a new cell phone, a gift from her improvised son-in-law, and proudly showed her granddaughter's screenshots in news reports. "Look at her here, the girl with the half moon. Now everyone knows what I already knew." With the unexpected success of the book, Emily began to be invited to conversation circles, lectures at schools, and interviews on podcasts. But even with all this, she never stopped going back to the pharmacy or visiting her neighbors. She kept her feet on the ground. And it was during one of these informal conversations with Andrew, already at home, sitting on the porch next to Grandma Evelyn, that the idea came to her. "What if we created a space," she said, looking at the darkening sky. "A place where other people could tell their stories, be cared for, not just in their bodies, but here too," pointing to her chest. Andrew smiled. "You're talking about a clinic," she nodded. "But not a cold clinic, a place with a name, with a soul." And so the first idea for the Luna Clara Clinic was born, clear as the brand she carried and as the light she wanted to spread. Over the next few months, Andrew made connections, secured donations, and even used some of the profits from the family hospitals to support the project. But he made it clear, "This is yours. I'm here to support you." Emily was involved in every detail, from the name on the facade to the choice of chairs at the reception. "I wanted it to be welcoming, so that whoever came in would feel seen." Luna Clara was officially opened on a sunny November morning. The sign at the entrance read, "Here, every story matters." The clinic offered medical care, therapeutic writing workshops, psychological support, and listening circles for women who, like Emily, carried invisible scars. On the opening day, as she cut the ribbon with a pair of simple scissors, with Grandma Evelyn on one side and Andrew on the other, everyone present gave a standing ovation. And not because of the structure of the building, but because they knew what that construction represented. "This is more than a clinic," Emily said in her short speech, in front of neighborhood residents, hospital staff, and curious young people. "It's a piece of my body, my past, and my courage. I thought my fire had extinguished everything in me. But I learned that fire also lights up, and that we can rekindle other lives when we choose to continue." Andrew watched her with the same look he had when he first saw her with the mark on her shoulder. The same woman who arrived shyly at the office now told her own story in front of everyone. That wasn't just a cycle closing. It was the birth of a new chapter, written by many hands, with a font that is not easily erased. And in the eyes of those who listened, there were sincere tears, of those who, for the first time, also saw themselves there. After the inauguration, Emily returned to writing. This time, not about pain, but about reconstruction. The new book was less autobiographical, but it carried the same soul. Andrew, now her life and project partner, remained by her side, but let her shine on her own. "You taught me that saving someone isn't always about carrying them in your arms," he said one night. "Sometimes it's just about being around when the person starts walking," Emily replied with a calm smile. "And you taught me that it's not wrong to look back, as long as we know where we want to go." The pages took shape as the clinic grew. With each patient she saw, with each story shared in a listening circle, Emily felt that something in her was healing too. And so I wrote, no longer as a rant, but as a beacon. 1 year after the opening of Luna Clara, the clinic was already a reference in care in the region. Volunteers from various areas began to appear, and a support network formed around the project. Emily was known not only as a writer, but as someone who listened carefully. She had a way of making people feel seen, perhaps because for so long, she herself felt invisible. Andrew continued to run the hospital network, but his favorite place was that small clinic with its light walls and large windows. Sometimes, after work, he would come in with sweet bread and sit next to her in the empty waiting room, the two of them in silence, just listening to the sound of the city outside. They didn't need to say much. Time had taught us that. Presence, in itself, was the strongest of gestures. One night, as they were closing the clinic windows together, Emily turned to him and said, "You know what's crazy?" Andrew looked up. "What?" She smiled. "That I spent my whole life thinking that the mark on my shoulder was a defect. And now, it's like it brought me everything I needed most." He approached, his eyes calm. "She was never a flaw. She was a calling. And I spent 20 years listening." Emily rested her head on his chest as she had done so many times before, but now with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found her place. Outside, the Luna Clara sign glowed softly in the dark. Inside, just the two of them, in peace, as if, after all, they had been saved by fire and transformed by everything that came after. At the end of that same year, Emily published her second book. It was called Saved by Fire. It was a mixture of fiction and memory, healing and truth. He wasn't just talking about trauma, but about starting over, of love. And once again, she reached hearts she never imagined. At one of the book signings, a woman came up to me with a baby in her arms and said, "I read your first book when I was pregnant. It kept me from giving up." Emily held the woman's hand gently, and in that simple touch, she understood again why she wrote. As the woman walked away, Andrew approached from behind, placed his hand on her back and whispered, "You have changed so many lives, including mine." She turned her face and kissed him, right there, in front of the bookshelves. And in that kiss, there was more than love. There was history. Today they live together in a simple house, with a garden full of herbs and flowers that Grandma Evelyn still insists on taking care of. The clinic is still alive. The books continue to reach new readers, and Emily writes whenever she feels like it, sometimes in the wee hours of the morning, sometimes on her lunch break. Andrew often jokes that she writes like she breathes, and she replies that it was he who taught her to breathe calmly. Every now and then, when the sun sets behind the mountains, the two of them walk silently to the backyard, and there, under the late afternoon light, she lightly touches her left shoulder and smiles. He understands the gesture without needing words, because some stories, when they are true, don't need an explanation, only those who remain. And they remained, whole, together, and with their souls at peace. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. Stay tuned.